Number 1. At the Window. This happened back in my teenage years. I come from a pretty tight-knit family, and my aunts and uncles are all pretty close to each other. My dad is the oldest, and therefore, out of all of our cousins, I am the oldest. And because of that, I tended to end up babysitting for many of my younger cousins. I also grew up out in the country, in eastern Kentucky. So this story takes place pretty far out of town. My uncle had 3 kids, and he lived way out on an old gravel road. It was an old 2-story house that, despite being so out in the country, I enjoyed being at. I guess I also liked it because he had a satellite dish, so I was able to get a lot of good channels and movies, which wasn't as common back at the time. I was 15 at the time. My oldest cousin was a 13-year-old boy named Jimmy. Then there were 2 girls, one 11 and one 6. Both of the girls were supposed to be in bed by 8 p.m., but the boy was allowed to stay up later. Jimmy and I always got along well, so I always let him stay up as late as he wanted to. Around 10 p.m., I got up and went into the kitchen to make myself a snack. I may have been in there for about 10 minutes. When I came back into the living room, I noticed that the 6-year-old, Sandy, was leaving the room. When I asked Jimmy what that was about, he told me that she had complained about seeing a monster outside of her window. Obviously, it had been an issue lately, with the monster being at different places. Sometimes it was in her closet. Other times it was under her bed. This time, she had stayed in the living room while Jimmy went outside to make sure there was nothing outside. When he let her know the coast was clear, Sandy was happy and she went back to bed. This was new to me, so I asked Jimmy how long this had been going on, and he shrugged. Apparently for about a month or so. His parents figured Sandy had just been having nightmares, and Jimmy was being a good big brother, always doing his best to help her out. Around 11, I got up to go to the bathroom. Walking into the hallways, I jumped when I saw someone standing in the hallway. Of course it was Sandy, and she was standing there, rubbing her eyes. She said that the monster was back outside the window, and she needed Jimmy to go out and check things out for her. I told her it was all right to go and tell him, and I went to the bathroom. When I made it back into the living room, it was right at the time that Jimmy was coming back into the house. When he came back in, I noticed that he was carrying his pocket knife with him. He told Sandy the coast was clear, and that the monster must have run away. He put the knife in his pocket, and Sandy went to bed. It wasn't unusual to see one of my cousins holding a pocket knife. Every one of the boys have had them since they were much younger. However, I was curious as to why he had it out, so I asked him. I assumed maybe he was really scared or something. Jimmy shrugged. He told me that he always took the knife out of his pocket before going outside. He thought it made it seem more realistic that he was defending his sister against a possible monster. Like before, Jimmy and I went back to watching the movie. It was maybe about 45 minutes later when Sandy came back in the room for a 3rd time. She told us the monster was back, and she needed Jimmy to scare it away. Jimmy, who proved over and over again that he was just an excellent and patient big brother, took out his pocket knife and told us he would be back. He went outside again. Sandy sat on the couch with me, and I turned the channel away from the scary movie that Jimmy and I were watching. Jimmy tended to take about 5 minutes to go around the house. I guess it was to actually convince Sandy that he had been checking. However, he was out for much longer than that. After a while, Sandy began to worry, thinking that the monster had gotten Jimmy. I did my best to calm her down, but the longer Jimmy was away, the more frantic she got. Finally, I had to wake up the other girl, Jenny, and have her watch Sandy while I went out and checked for Jimmy. I have to admit, I was a bit scared going outside. I was pretty confident that Jimmy would not have tried to scare me or Sandy, so I was really concerned. I didn't see Jimmy outside as I walked around the house. But when I got to the back of the house, I worried when I found his pocket knife laying on the ground, and it had blood on it. I wanted to run back in the house at that point, but I wasn't going to. I kept looking around until I finally heard something, and it was coming from the shed, set back away from the house. I made my way over to it. I recognized the voice as Jimmy's, and removed the board to open up the shed. Jimmy had a lot of blood over him, and I saw that his hand was cut. I asked what happened, and he looked around frantically. He saw his knife in my hand and took it. "We need to get to the girls now," he yelled, running toward the house. I wanted to know what was going on, but I just followed him. Back in the living room, the girls were fine. Jimmy grabbed his father's rifle off the mantel and then ran into Sandy's bedroom, telling me to call the police. I heard a blast and had to gather the girls up as I called the sheriff's office. I told the girls to stay by the fireplace as I went to check on Jimmy. When I looked in the room, I was shocked to see a man laying on the ground, holding his leg. Jimmy was standing in the doorway, the rifle pointed at the guy. It wasn't until the police got there that I got the entire story about what had happened. Jimmy had caught the man trying to get in the house through Sandy's window. The guy struggled with him, and Jimmy stabbed him in the arm. But the man, being much bigger than Jimmy, overpowered him and dragged him to the shed. Apparently, the man then climbed in through the window and patiently waited for Sandy to go back to bed. What's worse is that Jimmy knew who the man was. He was a friend of Jimmy's dad. The man went to jail, but sadly wasn't there very long. But Jimmy's dad was a huge country boy type, and when the man got out of jail, I know he probably wished he had never been released. Number 2. The Bridge. I don't really want to reveal where this happened. I still live in the area, and if people hear this story, they might know it came from me. All I will say is that it did not happen in the United States. I live in a very mountainous area. Very often, the roads going up through the mountains are connected by bridges. Most are rather ordinary, but some of them will give you a very beautiful view of the countryside. There is one that, when I was younger, was known for being a popular spot for young lovers to go for walks by. But although the view off the bridge was quite beautiful, that's not really why. There was a local ghost story about the bridge that if you began crossing it, you had to keep from looking behind you until you reached the other side. If you looked back, you would see the ghost of a woman who died when a jealous lover pushed her off of the bridge. And that brings me to my story. When I was a 14-year-old boy, that's around the time that I first started getting interested in girls. However, they really didn't begin showing any interest in me until a couple of years later. I was 17 years old, and I began seeing this girl who I will call Janet. Although I found her to be really beautiful, I often wondered why she would be dating someone as plain as me, but I didn't let that bother me too much. One night, after we had been seeing each other for a couple of months, Janet and I had gone out for a late dinner. Afterward, we decided to go for a drive. We weren't really going anywhere, just trying to enjoy the warm summer night. We had the windows all rolled down and had a nice breeze going. It was nice. At one point, Janet realized that we were on the road and coming up towards the bridge that I spoke about earlier in the story. She asked me if I ever did the walk over the bridge before. I hadn't, and she wanted to do it. I won't lie, I was really scared of the supernatural. I didn't want to. My fear is why I had never done this. But I did not want to look like a coward in front of the only girlfriend I had ever had before, so I agreed. We parked the car on one side of the bridge. It was only then that, for the first time, I realized you had to look back at the other side to go back to your car. But I didn't bring this up. Janet held my hand, and the two of us began walking over the bridge. I could tell right away that while I was nervous, Janet wasn't. She was holding my hand out of affection, not fear. I think she was so excited by doing this that she didn't notice how scared I was. I kept feeling like I wanted to turn around. You know, temptation to do something you know might hurt you. But I didn't. I just kept holding her hand, and I kept walking forward. In addition to being scared of whatever might happen on the bridge, I was also scared she would notice how terrified I was. Every sound, every little change in the wind, caused me to jump a little bit. Janet seemed oblivious, however. About halfway across the bridge, though, Janet let go of my hand. I looked at her, but was shocked when she suddenly ran to the side of the bridge and climbed up on the railing and suddenly dropped off, plummeting below. I was shocked by how suddenly it had happened. I couldn't move at first, but then I ran to the side, trying to find her off the steep drop. Of course, the fall was so far that I couldn't see her. I was in complete shock, but I had to go get my car. Forgetting about the silly bridge story, I turned and ran back to my car. And I got in it, and I drove down the mountain to get the authorities. After a search, Janet's body was found. She had died on impact. To my surprise, the police questioned me, and I realized it was under suspicion that I had pushed her off. But there were no signs of a struggle, which there would have had to have been to get her over the railing. The police determined she committed suicide, which always seemed odd to me, that she was in such a good mood before it. I guess I always thought maybe she saw something and jumped up on the rail to see it better and slipped. I don't know. I just know I have never seen anything close to being that terrifying ever since. Number 3. Exploration. I know there are a million exploration stories out there, but I think mine might be one of the scariest. I grew up in West Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountain area. There wasn't a whole lot to do out there, really. I mean, comparison to the way things are nowadays. We barely got a couple TV channels, and there wasn't a way to get cable where we lived. This was before the proliferation of video game systems. And we lived several miles away from any of my family and friends. So during the summer, the only thing I had to do was go out and explore. Growing up in that area, I honestly had to go further and further each time in order to find anything new. so sometimes I would find new creeks, little old abandoned sheds, animal skeletons. I remember one time I found a spearhead, which I brought home and I still have to this day. The worst thing I found, though, was something I do not still have to this day. It happened on a really hot summer day. I had been out for a very long time, and I ventured into an area I had never been before. There was an electric barbed wire fence that I had to cross. So I knew that I was going onto someone's property that I wasn't supposed to be on. However, there weren't any no trespassing signs that I saw, so I convinced myself that the fence was there to keep in livestock. However, I really don't remember seeing any livestock that day. After a couple hours of not really seeing anything of note, and the most interesting thing I heard was a woodpecker, I saw a very small building. I got excited, because sometimes finding an old shed really is the most interesting thing. I came up to it, and it was really old and decaying. However, it did have a substantial sized lock on the door. I knew I wouldn't be able to break the lock, but the wood the latch was attached to was so old and rotted, I was convinced I could easily break it off. I tried for a while to break it off just using my hands, but I couldn't do it. So I began looking around for something to use as a tool. Eventually, I found a pretty good-sized rock, and I brought it back to the shed. I guess I should have felt bad about trying to break into someone's old shed, but I really didn't even think about it. I assumed that it was abandoned, and that the owner of the property probably didn't even know it was there. Plus, I was more interested in entertaining myself than really respecting someone else's property. After a lot of effort, hitting the latch over and over again, I finally was able to break it off from the shed, and then I pulled it off. I opened the door and stepped in. The inside of the shed was probably about an 8x8 size, and there were some pretty old and rusted tools hanging up on the wall. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the left-hand wall, there was a workbench, and laying under that workbench was an honest-to-God human skeleton. I felt a little freaked at first, but my mind began trying to think of reasonable explanations for it. I approached it, and then I paused, and was really scared when I saw a rusted pair of handcuffs on the skeleton's hands. I decided to get out of there. Now don't get me wrong, I wasn't really scared. This skeleton had been there for a very long time, and that shed had probably not been opened in many years. I also was really far away from any houses, so I didn't think anyone was just gonna come across me that day. But I did feel like I stumbled upon something that I really wished I hadn't. So I closed it up and made my way back home. When my dad got home, I did explain to him what I found. I thought maybe we should call the police. He did not want me to, saying that whatever had happened was none of my business really. So we didn't call. I told a few of my friends the discovery, but they really didn't believe me. They just thought I was trying to scare them, like guys do to each other. I've never been back out to that area, and I don't know who it was in that shed to this day. But I do know that I found a dead body, and that since it was in handcuffs, the person was likely put there against their will. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. Not a lot to say today, so I'm just gonna jump right into the spiel. If you want to read print versions of these stories, please check them out at the Killer Orange Cat subreddit. Links to that and the merchandise store are in the description. In the meantime, if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below, or using the icon of Ichigo that will appear at the end of this closing. Feel free to leave me a comment to let me know what you think of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can always follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter using the links in the description. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address provided in the description. And my main requirement is that the story is original, meaning it has not yet been read on any other YouTube channel. And please, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.